Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome to, I suppose you could call this part 2, but not quite part 2, because I'm not quite going to treat it like a part 2, of the RSS Formula Hybrid 2022 review. S version, yes. Unlike previous years, Racing Studio, when they've released Formula Hybrid, we have gotten one single Formula Hybrid. This time around, though, we've got two of them. And this is the follow-on to my probably bigger review of the basic version of Formula Hybrid, FH22 full stop. This one is FH22S. Yes, we don't just have a second trim level available in the car selection screen when it comes to Formula Hybrid 2022. No, we have a full-on second car in this year's release. Why have we done this, and what really are the differences between FH22 and FH22S? Well, the 60-plus minutes traffic of our stage endeavors to explain some of those differences. By no means am I under any illusion that I'm going to be able to cover all of the little nuances that distinguish these two cars, but I'm going to try my best, because I know that many of you are probably wondering after my first video that only covered FH22 full stop, what about that second car? So here is that second car. Formula Hybrid 2022S has come before us in the showroom. And first of all, probably the biggest visual distinguishing factor between these two cars is right here on the front end, as you can see. If you are familiar with the overall designs of the current year 2022 Formula 1 cars in the real world, you will probably have noted that FH22 has a front end that looks very reminiscent of designs like, say, Ferrari are running. We have got a very sculpted nose that comes down low and it tapers to a point right at the front end. This is a little bit different here on FH22S, and you can see quite plainly that the nose section on 22S is much more squared off. It terminates a little bit sooner, so a little bit of a shorter nose, and it has a slightly higher, maybe not really higher, but definitely a wider cross-section of a nose tip that we can see right here. So we've got that divergent design all ready to play with. We've also got a slightly differently sculpted front wing on this car. The same four closed elements, the same upturned end fences, the same little vortex generators that you can see there on the extreme outboard sides of the end fences. They're all still standard, homologated, whatever, as far as the technical regulations are concerned. But the shapes of the winglets and things like that, those are areas where the engineers do get a chance to play, and of course Racing Studio got a chance to play with that as well. You can see the differences between FH22 and FH22S in terms of the shapes of the flaps, the brackets that are holding the flaps in place, the flap adjusters, and things like that. These are all areas where these two designs distinguish themselves, and that's just on the front end here, macrocosmically speaking. But of course, just as we had on the standard car, we've got great detail inside and out on this thing. And just generally, let's talk about some of the things that we see here on FH22S. I made a big deal in the initial video about listed parts, unlisted parts, homologated parts, standardized parts, all of these different parts that are on all of the Formula 1 cars. Needless to say, all of the parts that we talked about in terms of things that are listed parts, standardized homologated components that we saw on FH22 standard, they're also here on the S car. Because just like its stablemate, FH22S is also 100% race legal for the 2022 Formula 1 technical regulations. So, therefore, things like the front wheel fairings that we talked about at some length in the initial review of FH22, they're still here, identically here on FH22S, because they are one of those listed parts, and they have to be this specific way that you see them here in order to be legal per the technical regulation. So all of those things remain on this car. So I'm not really going to get into any subminiature detail on things like this on this particular version, simply because they will be identical, because they must be identical on this car versus FH22. Same deal with the camera mounts here on the front end. Upon further review, though, I did note that this actually is a camera lens. So those of you who were saying, F-Man, are you blind? That's a camera lens. Yes, this is a camera lens on the two front-end cameras here on FH22. That's the same on the S and the standard version as well. Things that are the same, as we're going to be going into this vein, between the FH22 and FH22S, well, more or less, we have got very similar treatments across the entire front end of the car, apart from the nose and wing assembly. Obviously, the place where the nose attaches to the monocoque and the shape of the monocoque itself, more or less, is homologated in the regulations, simply because, well, we've got testing concerns, we've got safety concerns, we've got crash integrity concerns. So all of these things are basically homologated, and for the most part, I think we could even say that FH22 and FH22S share a chassis, in that they share the monocoque and they share a lot of the macrocosmic design between them. So can you say that they're two different cars? Yes, you can, but also you cannot. The chassis is the same, but look at it like this. You've got two teams that have built a chassis and they're sharing it with each other, but they're allowed to develop them in different directions. Right, so think if we had proper customer cars in Formula One, you might see something like this. So same overall developer, same overall management scheme, but we've got some different philosophies in terms of more of the technical details on this car. So you can see where this is going. Other things that are the same on the front end, obviously Halo, homologated part. So the mounting points, the sizes and shapes of everything, homologated, we can't change it. Other things that are the same, these mirror stalks and the fairings around the mirrors themselves, the same. This little flick up that we made a big deal of on the FH22 review, which is unique to RSS, the same between the two cars. These little fins as well, with the little legality cuts in them, the same between the two cars. So yes, you can see that there is a lot of carryover between these two. Some of the differences, though, we go down a little bit on the front end. The radiator inlets are the same, as are generally the shape and sizes of the side pods. They are the same between the two cars. The tunnel entrances here as well, the same between the two cars. But along the floor, we start to have some variances, some variations in terms of this design. Remember on FH22, we talked about these sculpted lines here on the outboard edge of the floor. They're here quite obviously on 22S, but what was missing is this little section in here where we have got these little strakes just coming off the floor here. They're channeling some of the high pressure air out of the floor, which is interesting. What they're trying to do is they're attempting to actually alleviate a little bit of the downforce. They're trying to bleed out some of that downforce, because one of the things that we made a big deal of and we spent a lot of time of with FH22 was the porpoising issue. You're not going to get porpoising with 22S. Believe me, I have tried. I have not really been able to induce it with this car. One of the reasons is the under tray is working macrocosmically in the same way, but we've got little details like this, these Vortex Generators here, which are basically serving as a bleed valve between the ground and the floor. They're trying to cut down on the stalling of the diffuser, which is really the genesis of the porpoising problem. So you've got this little detail here. What they're doing with this air otherwise is they are trying then to entrain it to the outboard edge of the floor and then feed the diffuser this way, just like it was doing on FH22. But we didn't have this little bleed section. So that's one of the distinguishing characteristics right there. Otherwise, though, rear suspension, it's going to be the same. The brake duct here and the fairings along the outboard side of the rear suspension, these are going to be more or less the same. You can see the three-step design that we covered in the previous review. It's still here, fine. The diffuser outlet, the same, as you can tell. The beam wing, the same. There's our 10mm gap between the bottom of the top of the beam wing and the bottom of the exhaust. All of that is still there and identical. We have got our exhaust pipe here, which is still there and identical, with our convergent wastegate and turbine exhaust right through here with these glorious weld seams. We didn't really remark about this in the initial review, but the amount of time that was spent just modeling this exhaust is phenomenal. And yes, it definitely shows. I love the color gradients and the texturing that's going on here. It really makes everything look authentic. Additionally, one of the differences here, we've got a slightly different geometry of the rear wing, not in terms of the end fences really or anything like that, but this top flap of the rear wing, it's different between the two cars, and well, it definitely does show. I do very much like all of that, and again, it shows the variations that are possible amid some pretty prescriptive and restrictive technical regulations. There's our DRS Flap Actuator right there. It works mechanically in the same way as the other car. However, you can see just some of the geometries are a little bit different here. We have got slightly longer linkages because of the shape of this upper flap and the gurney as well on the rear wing. That's all fine. Another detail here that I didn't notice on the other car, RSS22 RW1. Yeah, we've got serial numbers and everything. That's cool on the gurney flap itself. And another little detail that I just wanted to note here. You see these yellow stickers? They're also on the standard version of the car. Remember in 2020 and 2021 where we had a little bit of a polemic about flexible rear wings? Well, these dots here are designed for the cameras. They want to have a fixed frame of reference with known dimensions for the rear view cameras, and if those frames of reference move outside of a given tolerance, they'll be able to say your rear wing is flexing too much at speed. You need to remedy that or we're going to throw you out of the championship. So that's what those things are. They're also on FH22 full stop. They're here on the S as well, and I neglected to point them out last time, so here we are pointing them out here, and once again, an entirely authentic detail. Another thing that is going to be similar between the two cars, the cooling gills, the little radiator exhausts through here, through the side pods. You can also change those in the setups screen. You can close them down if you would like, but they're here in showroom quite obviously. Other things that are going to be the same, the snorkel and air box with the roll bar integrated in there, the same. That's great. We've got our two marshal and kill switches on either side, the same as well. We've got, these are refueling hatches. Obviously no refueling in the race, but for refueling in the garage, that's where you'd have that. Our fins on Halo are identical between the two cars as well. Really, really nice. As is this T-bar camera mount that we remarked about at length in the previous review. Still here, basically the same because, again, homologated part. Blank camera mount on the side of the snorkel, which of course you can location swap if you so desire. Another refueling hatch here on the left side of the car. Really cool. And then basically the trailing edge of the side pod and then the center zone where all of the air exhausts out of the engine bay, identical as well. So lots of commonality between these two cars, but some differences which on the face of them don't appear to be all that much visually. But they do conspire to create some different handling, which is very interesting. Another difference on the front end, we've got a different pitot array here. You can see on FH22, this is just almost a freestanding antenna tripod structure. Here we've got a proper pitot array in carbon, with two pitot tubes and then an antenna on top. Obviously this would be flashing telemetry back to the pits. That all looks cool. We still have our 360-degree camera in a homologated position, in a homologated mount. We've got our antenna here as well, probably for more data logging, or maybe the car's radio, things like that. Our same Halo front stay with the hashtag No to War. We have got our same cockpit camera here for the broadcast as well as for the FIA safety people. And then in the cockpit itself, we have got our foam, our collar, obviously for driver safety and a little bit of comfort. And then in the cockpit, looking from the driver's eye position, obviously the same Rexing steering wheel reproduced faithfully in here. And then more or less in the cockpit, not too much is different in here because, again, we have effectively a shared chassis. Mainly in here, just looking for any details that I neglected to mention on the other car, but I think we actually did a pretty good job. Chassis plates again, we have got the same chassis plates between the two cars. So again, you can see, yes, we do have a lot of common heritage between FH22 and FH22S. Again, same chassis we can say, but developed along slightly different aero philosophies, which is cool. Same pedals down here, same little bits of somewhat rudimentary but still appreciated modeling behind the pedals for the brake lines and the electronic lines for the fly-by-wire throttle, brake master cylinders, and then the very front end of the monocoque once again. I also like the pink foam for the driver's knees there, obviously pulling a lot of G's in a Formula One car, and for the stablemate to this car, porpoising from time to time, so you want some cushioning so the driver doesn't end up with black and blue legs after every time he's in the car, so that is very cool. Not something unique to this car. We have seen RSS do this expanded foam modeling before in the cockpit footwell areas of some of their open wheelers, but I always appreciate things like this, so it bears mention once again. Coming out of the cockpit, we'll pull out a little bit and just get an overall sense of the presence of this car in showroom. Obviously, it looks very similar, and it is very similar in a lot of macrocosmic regards, but it is very different when we get it out on track, I do assure you. Other differences here, obviously, the skins. This skin here, we have got, quite obviously, we have the national colors of Ukraine on this car and one other. I suppose a bit of an homage to the circumstances in which this car was born. However, if we go through our default skins, we have got another Ukrainian flag car with a slightly different scheme on the halo, as you can see here. This one it's yellow, and on this one it's blue. Some differences here and there in terms of, obviously, numbers and the wheel fairings as well. This one's got a gold stripe around the upper edge of the wheel fairings. This one has a blue one, and then we get into some of the skins that are trying to emulate some of the teams in terms of the real world. This is a McLaren looking skin. We have got, not quite sure what you would call this one, but I like it. I like more muted colors, but I also like red, so this one wins in my book, as does this one. Here, I suppose you could say this kind of looks like an Alpine, but we need some pink on it. And then if we go back the other way, we have... I wonder which team this one is going for. This must be a Ferrari. No, clearly Mercedes. And we've got some differences here on this skin in particular. You see this one, I suppose you could say that this would be more of a standard type Mercedes livery, but you go to this one, and we've got all this fun stuff going on in the upper flanges of these wheel fairings. This is clearly an homage to the slightly tie-dye livery that Mercedes ran in some places as an accent color for the Miami Grand Prix this year. And here we have got something interesting. This is a Sean Bull design commissioned for this car, and it obviously is not trying to emulate any real-world team here, but just the design itself, I love it. It is so different. It's really unique. I like the almost oil slick type graphics going on here, but obviously lots of purples and little hints of blue here and there. It's really, really nice. Livery by Sean Bull Design, like that. Really like that. You get some of the patterning along here as well. What I would really like, if anybody out there is a skin painter and wants to make me happy, I really like the liveries that Red Bull used to run in testing, particularly the Dazzle camouflage liveries, but I would like one done in colors that make sense. If you wanted to camouflage a car on track, do like a World War I ship Dazzle camouflage scheme, but make it blend into the surrounding colors on a racetrack. I just want to see that work. That'd be really cool. So if you're a skin painter and you want to appease me and become my hero, do that. But otherwise, that's what we've got going on here with FH22S. Again, very similar in macrocosmic terms to FH22. Same chassis. Obviously, we're going to have the same wheelbase, the same track widths and things like that, but little differences here and there, mainly in the floor and the front and rear wings, as well as obviously the nose. But we've got a very different experience out on track. It's just different, and you're going to see what I mean when we go to, where else? Imola next. Welcome to Imola. Before we get out on track, of course, we're going to take a look through the setup screens to show you some of the differences between this S trim and the standard FH22. But first of all, though, just a look at this car from our vantage point here in terms of sitting in pit lane under the natural light, and you can see that we have got ourselves
Again, great modeling and texturing work courtesy of RaceSim Studio, as all the shadows now falling across the car because it's being lit more or less from directly above at this point. Everything looking absolutely immaculate, as we have seen prior, not only in FH22, but from every RaceSim Studio product. But I just like how the more intense light brings out some of the finer details here. The carbon that we remarked about so much on the FH22 review, obviously the same here, but it just looks so great now under the natural sunlight. And it, again, it really brings the thing together visually. And of course, the visual impact is the first impression that you get on any Assetto Corsa mod, and this one is presented very, very nicely. All of those 572,024 triangles and 340 total objects just coming together to create one very impressive visual package here for us. And again, not too many teams pull this together in the way that RaceSim Studio does. But regardless, back into the pits with us, what have we got going on here on this setup screen? Well, we do have some minor differences here between 22S and 22. First of all, on the gear screen, obviously we have got 8 forward ratios, and they are all fixed as you might well expect because, well, Formula One, you declare the ratios at the beginning of the year, and then you are committed to them forevermore. However, you're going to see that there are some different speeds that are theoretically possible in each gear, with a theoretical Vmax of 365 kilometers per hour, assuming a vacuum and no rolling resistance. Why do we have different speeds here in terms of what's theoretically possible? Well, this car also has a different engine than the standard FH22. This one is producing 985 horsepower, combine the 1.6-liter V6 plus the hybrid powertrain. And it's also putting out 570 newton meters of torque. So slightly different engine specifications here on FH22S. Hence, we have different gear ratios, and we have slightly different theoretical Vmaxes in each gear. So again, these are things to keep in mind as being different between the two cars. Also, we have got a very different sound package on this car versus the FH22 standard version. So I would say that the engine sound on the standard car, more or less pretty much a dead ringer for the Ferrari. This one, very much patterned after the Mercedes, as you will hear. Tire screen, though, what have we got? We've got our same tire compounds here. We have got soft, we can go to super soft and ultra soft, or we can go back up through the range into medium, hard, and then our rain compound there for those of you who like to play with CSP weather. Tire pressures, default value shown here, 17 PSI in the front, 16 in the rear. Range of adjustment goes all the way up to 25 PSI, or all the way down to 15 PSI front and rear if you so desire. Fuel, obviously we've got it zeroed out to keep the engine quiet, but maximum fuel capacity, just as we had on the standard version, 148 liters, as you can see there. Electronics, same screen as we had before. This is our hybrid power system for the most part, so we have the same power modes, balanced, low, build, and no deploy going down, and then high and attack going up. MGUK recovery, again, this is the harvest rate off of the rear axle. Defaults to 50%, goes between 0 and 100 if you want. The MGUH, this is the motor generator unit, run off the turbocharger. We can tell it to charge the battery, or we can tell it to send that power back into the hybrid system for deployment immediately. And then the engine braking. Once again, just telling the throttles to hang open for a little bit longer once we are off the pedal. Aerodynamics. This is another difference, not just between the standard car and this car, but a difference between version 1 of Formula Hybrid 2022 and version 2 of Formula Hybrid 2022. Of course, the day that I had completed and uploaded the review of FH22 that I did prior, we got an update to the car. So we now have version 2. One of the differences between version 1 and version 2 is this aerodynamic screen here. What we had on version 1 of the car was everything changed in a package deal in terms of high downforce, medium downforce, different aero packages that were available on the car, but you didn't have any real fine control over the front to rear balance using the front and rear wings. You can do that here on version 2. So we can change the slot gap widths really on the front wing as well as the rear wing just for a small balance adjustment, but our main downforce adjustment still done as a package deal here. We've got very low, low, medium, high, and very high, so default setup puts it at high. Brakes, brake bias, and brake power defaults to 53% to the front in terms of brake bias, and then the brake power is 100%, so a 1-to-1 between the pedal and the brake action. You can go all the way up to 115% or all the way down to 70% in terms of what your tastes are. Drivetrain, differential adjustments in power, coast, and preload. Default values are shown. Our suspension screens, for the most part, they are the same as we had on version 1 of the car. However, some of the physics and some of the effects are slightly updated on version 2, but here we have got camber and tow on all 4 corners with default values shown. The main screen, anti-roll bar rates front and rear, plus ride heights, travel ranges, and wheel rates on all 4 corners. The dampers here, these are your bound and rebound rates in terms of fast and slow for your bump absorption from the push rods or pull rods on the suspension for each wheel. And here are the heave springs, your third springs. Again, on the standard version of the car, this is very important if you want to control that porpoising action. On this car, though, because of the revisions in the floor, we really don't get into the porpoising very much, if at all. So this is not quite as important in terms of stability of the car, but if you want to, again, fine-tune the balance, fine-tune the way that the car is responding to your inputs, particularly under acceleration, these heave springs are very important. And of course, if your ride height is too low, you're not necessarily going to get porpoising, but you are going to bottom the floor, and if you control your third springs correctly, you can run it lower and still have it stable. Various steering assist, your power steering, your FFB linearity, things like that. I don't mess with this, but that's what this is. Visuals, we have the same visual adjustments on this car as we have on the standard version. So that includes hiding the center stay of halo, as you can see here. It also includes winglets on top of halo, as you can see here, perhaps. Yes, there we go. These are little Vortex Generators here. They are not on the standard car, but a little bit of a difference here in terms of running FH22S. We do, though, have our camera mounts available here. So you can see this snorkel camera. We can take it off. We can put it on the right side of the car or the left side of the car. Optional hot and cold. These are the same exhaust gills on the radiators right there. We can blank them off, or we can have them all showing. Right here we have got our front-end camera. And we don't have our front-end camera. We have our windscreen for the cockpit. Yes. There we go. So the same visual windscreen styles that we have on the standard car are also available here. And then our shut line tape. You can see right there. We can have it there or we can remove it. I like to have it there because, again, it's another little detail that you don't see on too many mods. And I like it when we get little visual options like that. Makes no difference to the performance, of course, but I like it there for a presentation option. So that's really cool. However, we will go out here on default setup. Right there. 50 liters in the tank. We'll go into cockpit. And here in the cockpit, the same steering wheel as we have on the standard car, of course, and pretty much the same cockpit as well. So really nothing new to see in here visually speaking, but everything, of course, is done absolutely immaculately. We also have the same animations on the driver's legs for throttle and brake action, so that is really cool as well. If not something that perhaps is not so noticeable most of the time, but it is happening, and I appreciate that. And then, of course, all of our instrumentation on the steering wheel is the same because it is the same steering wheel. You will notice, though, that we have got a slightly lower idle RPM here, 3950, versus the standard car, which is idling right at bang on 4,000. So, again, we have a different engine in this car, albeit very similar, of course, with a little bit more horsepower. So we've got slightly different characteristics across the entire power band, which is really cool, and it's also warranting the different gear ratios in the transmission. Tire pressures and everything else still in the same places, though, as is our current lap, which is just ticking past 10:05, which means we ought to get out on track for our default run. Let's do it. Let the clutch out slowly. Right, and we are rolling. No tire blankets for me. So we'll have to be quite deliberate bringing everything in. And you can already start to hear the different sounds available on this version of Formula Hybrid 2022. Which one do I really prefer? I don't know. There's full revs. A little bit of hybrid deployment there. Turn that off for the moment. And we're just bringing everything up to temperature here in terms of the brakes and tires. Again, with no tire blankets, you're going to want to be very careful. You are recommended to run the tire blankets. Cool, with no hybrid, just touching 300 clicks before the braking zone for Tamburello. And a little bit of squirreliness from the rear end. Partially down to cold tires. However, you will see that this car has some markedly different initial handling characteristics than the standard version. Again, we have got a different floor here. We've got a slightly different aerodynamic philosophy happening and slightly less downforce, at least in terms of what's generated from the under tray. You'll see how that manifests. DRS open here. Still no hybrid deploy. We'll just put in an initial banker time, 124.225 or 325 rather. And at this point, it feels like the tires are pretty much there. The brakes are there. How is this car starting to give me feedback? What do I feel it can do? What do I feel it can't do? And what might I want to change on this setup? Well, first of all, much like its stablemate, you're going to notice that you have a lot of performance on tap here. Again, with the hybrid system on, 985 horsepower. So clearly it's going to have a lot of get up and go out of the corners. We do, of course, have ourselves quite a bit of weight on board as well, as par for the course for these 2022 Formula One regulations. The weight that we have got comes out to being 809 kilograms dry. So some of the heaviest open-wheel cars ever built, this side of World War II anyway. But still, greater than 1-to-1 power-to-weight ratio, 0.82 kilos per horsepower. So, you've got some power here. However, in contrast to FH22 full stop, we have ourselves a little bit of trepidation here. I did remark quite extensively and glowingly about how pointy the standard version of the car is in terms you just turn the wheel and it responds and it gives you confidence and it just has grip for days. This, yes, it's got a lot of grip, and you will have, grip for days. However, the way that it's delivered to you is fundamentally different. Again, we've got that different floor playing into our hands here, and it does not generate the all-out, end-all, be-all stability and downforce. This thing is a little bit skatey on the rear end. It is still very positive in terms of the front end. Yes, you are going to turn the wheel, and yes, you are going to get a pretty rapid and decisive response from it. But to me, it just feels a little bit more wild. It feels a little bit less glued to the ground. And therefore, in some cases, it does remove a little bit of that tremendous and supreme confidence that I have in the standard version of the car. This one will break free with a whole lot less persuasion. And it results in something that just feels a little bit more wild. Turn some hybrids power on now. Start trying to attack a little bit. Obviously, you turn the hybrid system on and you start making up whole eons per corner here in terms of your delta time. Already up 3/4 of a second. But the deployment is still pretty much the same as it was on the standard car. What differs is the power curve on the engine and therefore the gearing through the gearbox. Look at this, 1.5 seconds. You probably didn't see it there, but just the slightest of twitches starting to get set up from the rear end under power. That's something that doesn't happen on the standard car too much, unless you really overdo it. Little twitches all through Tamburello there as well. These are just little things that start to play into your mind, and you take note of them saying, it can't handle that maybe. So you need to adjust your driving style some. With the standard car, you can get into the power so early through most corners, and this one, you need to give it a little bit of space. Bit of a twitch off of the apex curbs in the second element of Variante Alta there. Final corner again, just a little bit of twitching under power. .638 that time by. And again, 36.5 liters of fuel on board on the soft tires, the C3 compound. We're not trimmed out for maximum performance here, but again, default setup, it's pretty good. It is pretty good. I will definitely give it that. But as you can see, it will twitch when you get under power, and that's just not something that the standard car does unless you really overstep the bounds. Here, of course, the same thing. If you don't respect the limits, it's going to start to protest and start to hit back at you. This one, though, feels like it's a little bit more eager to throw some punches in your direction. And through the Villeneuve chicane there, just having to give it another little moment backing back out of the power to compose itself, particularly on the rear end. And then through Piratella, again, just waiting for the car to settle down before you really give it the beans once more. There's definitely more of an element of instability, more of an element of, perhaps it's not quite ready yet. Definitely freer on the rear, definitely less overall downforce from the under tray. Definitely would call it a little bit more of a challenge overall. .491. Under braking, though, the big stop, for example, into Variante Alta, still very stable. The brakes themselves are very powerful, but very progressive. You can modulate the force very nicely. No real complaints there. It's just when the car rebounds off of bumps, when it rebounds off of curbing, that's where instability can start to make itself known, and that's where you've got to wait a little bit before getting back into the power hard. Basically, I suppose any sort of major change in attitude, whether it's angle of attack between the floor and the ground, whether it's steering angle or any sort of oscillation in the vertical plane, the car just takes another moment to settle down. And it results in you having to wait a little bit sometimes to get back into the power relative to FH22. Dive back into the pits here. All right, 10 laps on default. Again, it's approachable enough. It's stable enough. And of course, the performance level is enough. 985 horsepower, of course, it's going to be enough. But at the same time, though, in comparison to the standard version of the car, you will immediately note a little bit more instability, a little bit less assuredness in terms of basically all operating conditions. Again, this is just a default setup run on the C3 compound, so more performance yet to be gained just in terms of changing the tire compound. But it's not quite the same as the other car. And therefore, we've got two of them. So you can choose which one better suits your personal preferences, which is really cool. For me, though, so far, I'm looking like I prefer the standard FH22, just in terms of chassis dynamics. That one does more what I want it to do more often than this one seems to. But, again, more exploration to come here in terms of trimming it out for a qualifying setup. And, well, we're going to try to make it porpoise, but it's not going to work. And I'm going to show you that. Right, so it's back into the pits with us here. And let's see what we can do here to try and test out that theory on can we get porpoising to happen or not. Well, we've got the high downforce trim, that's fine. Don't really need to change anything on our corner suspensions, but the heave springs, again, that's where everything really came in on the standard version of the car to induce that porpoising motion. So we're going to really ramp up the travel ranges here. We're going to make our bump stops really hard, and we're going to see if we can make that porpoising happen. The only things that we really need to change otherwise on the main suspension screen are the ride heights. We're going to lower this ride height as much as we can. On the standard car, this is the recipe for inducing some really severe porpoising, and we're going to see what we could do here on this one. And you'll see that the response is going to be quite different on the S versus the standard version. Just going to get our hybrid system primed and ready to go for where I want it. And then beyond that, we got to put some fuel in a car. So we'll go back to default 50 liters. Then other than that, everything else is still at the default setup. We'll see what this does. Again, no tire blanket, so we got to get ourselves warmed up again. Still on the C3 compound, and immediately you can see that it will just spit you off if you are not careful. So again, cold tires, lower ride height. That's what this car can do to you, so just be mindful. Definitely feel the car is starting to bottom, even at the somewhat reduced speeds we're at right now. We gotta get those pressures up. There goes 300 clicks. We'd have pretty severe porpoising right now on the standard car. Just not happening here. Trying to get those rear pressures up to around 24. Right rear is there. Left rear will be following. One thing that I'm definitely noticing already just from the setup changes here, more understeer. Probably because we've got ourselves less ability to accommodate body roll now because the car just starts to hit the deck. Definitely wanting to hesitate a little bit more under power. Definitely not quite feeling confident enough to hold it flat through the first Acqua Minerale corner. See what it's got here. 120.834. Now 4/10 off of what we did on our last run so far. Again, a little bit more fuel on board than we had at the end of that run. I touched the grass there, that's my fault. Lots of understeer though through Tosa. More understeer. Again, the car turns in and then it sort of wallows into neutral sliding, and then it sort of settles down again back on the front axle with the weight transfer. But through the high-speed corners, there is a two-step process. You get it turned in, the car reacts, it doesn't like it, then it settles and it does like it. And it gives you more grip so you can finish going around a corner. But the big thing, no porpoising. None. Not even a hint. Running as low as we can with the hardest bump stops on the third springs. With the, not the highest, but pretty well high travel ranges on the third springs. Nothing. It is completely dead calm. Again, it's that differences in the floor geometry. More understeer, way wide. Holding it flat there through the first Acqua Minerale element. It just reacts badly though over that apex. Spits you out wide. Again, when you hit the apex curbs hard like that, you don't have much ride height. You are running out of capacity in the suspension to react to those oscillations and the bump, really, the shock load going into the car. So ultimately, you're just trying to bend the chassis, and that doesn't work. 120.495. Definitely at this point, I would say that on this setup, the car is just too rigid. It is not compliant over the bumps. It's, anytime you hit the curb, it just throws you out wider. The car is not willing to accept these oscillations so much. No porpoising, but still, this is not really what you want. 119.607, fastest lap of the session. So there is pace to be found here by running the car lower, but it's just not compliant. compliant enough in the straights, but you start to introduce body roll, or you introduce shock loading under hitting the curbs. Just, no, unsettling, way too unsettling. Particularly through here, I mean, come on. Even at low speeds, it does not like the curbing right now. So we dive back into the pits. I'll be glad to end that run. Just not compliant. Again, we've proven the point. You're not going to get porpoising in this car, but when you run it that low, some of the advantages that you do get by attempting to run as low as possible, in other words, a little bit more floor downforce and whatnot, it's negated by the fact that the car just becomes very non-compliant over the bumps, and it's just not something that's conducive to performance, because, I mean, you saw how inconsistent the car was from one corner to another. Yes, we did put in our fastest lap of this whole run, but did not come so easily. And again, we did our fastest lap of this whole run with more fuel on board than we had when we set our previous best. So again, this is maybe in theory faster, but again, it is not at all what you're going to want if you want to run this thing for long distances over a Grand Prix distance, for example. You're just fighting it far too much. The car is not particularly confidence-inspiring in terms of wanting to respond to your commands, in terms of trying to give you positive feedback. No, this will not do. All right, so one more time, back into the setup screen for us. We are going to try and trim this thing out for qualifying. So, Ultra Soft C5 compound, the fastest available tire with the least amount of life. Going to put some fuel on board, not a whole lot. Let's put in 20 liters. MGU settings, just got it all set up in terms of our outlap. Gonna leave the aero where it is. Opened up the differential all the way, because I like that. In terms of our suspension, not changing any alignments. The main screen, we have gone for a little bit of a harder anti-roll bar on the rear, but a little bit of a softer anti-roll bar on the front, and we'll see what that yields. So that's just generally what I feel like I'm going to need. Travel ranges have been clamped down a bit. The ride heights are back up on the rear. Actually, might want to put them up a little bit more. And a little bit more on the front as well in terms of higher ride height. Our third springs. Actually, I want these to be a little bit more linear. Again, we're looking for compliance. Other than that, though, let's head back out there and see what we can do. We gotta get ourselves some tire temperature. Should happen a bit more quickly on these Ultra Softs. Just don't want to knock the new out of them too quick, but at the same time, they need to be worked. Definitely feeling a bit more compliance on turn-in now. We'll see how it is over the bigger bumps when we really start to attack the curbing. Little bits of hints of squirreliness from the rear, but again, tires are still not 100% there. Again, it is pretty common to see these guys taking 2, sometimes even 3 warm-up laps. Feels like the understeer might be settled a bit. Tires are pretty much happy now. A little bit more of a warm-up to go, but should be okay to start pushing on them. So a little hint of protest from the rear axle. And off we go here on a flyer. Let's see what it's got. And a little bit too far. Yeah. It is a whole lot easier to throw this car off the road. I don't think we had any really major spins or anything on our previous review of the standard car. This one I've already spun it twice. Come on, car. Having to be so tentative getting back into the power. Still a little bit too much exit curb. Understeer is a little bit better there through Piratella. Definitely more compliant over the bigger bumps in the curbing. See what we can do here at the line. 119.256, I believe. 10 liters in the tank. A bit of rear locking there. DRS open, what do we got? Gonna be in the 18s. 118.757. Okay. So we now appear to have a setup that is more compliant. Not a ton more compliant. It's just a characteristic of this car. However, we do have some more pace now. And of course, we've got the softest available tires, so more pace from that perspective as well. There's our fuel light at 6.9 liters. Almost threw it off the road again there. It just got unsettled over that second apex there. At Variante Alta, and then just never settled down. On 19.225 to end. So all in all, what do we got here? We have got Formula Hybrid 2022 S. For the first time ever, 2 Formula Hybrids in the same year. A shared chassis, but some divergent opinions in terms of aerodynamic philosophy. Is there a difference between the 2 cars? Yes, there is. Is one better than the other? Well, ultimately, that's going to come down to your personal tastes. I know that I much prefer the standard version of the car. This one just does not have the compliance overall for me. Yes, you can be quick enough in it. Yes, there's a lot of performance here, but in terms of what I personally want from a car, in terms of what it does when I give it an input, no, I'd much rather prefer the standard version. What it all serves to do, though, is to illustrate, amid all of these highly prescriptive regulations in 2022 Formula One, it still shows that there is possibility for divergence and innovation, And that is why the designers and engineers get paid the big money that they do, because we've got some of the most prescriptive technical regulations in the history of the sport this year. So many standardized components, so many listed parts, so many parts that the teams don't even design. They just buy them from an outside supplier and bolt them on the car, and they've got to be that way. However, within that scope of such restrictive rules, you still have the potential to have so much variation in terms of the designs. And look at the real world as well. The Ferrari looks radically different from the Red Bull in many respects, which looks radically different from the Mercedes, which is probably the most radical car on the grid with its size zero side pod concept. And then you've got cars like the McLaren and the Aston Martin, which appear to have gone for some sort of setup that's similar to what we see here on FH22S. With the big nose, we've got the floor that's designed to mitigate the porpoising problems. Speaking of porpoising, I don't think McLaren really ever struggled with that, just such is the design of their floor and under tray and side skirt area. Ferrari appeared to be affected very severely by it, but it didn't hurt them very much. And then Mercedes are all over the map in terms of, well, we really need to figure out how to make this car know which way is up even. So we've had tremendous variation in the real world amid these very prescriptive regulatory designs, and we've got it here too with Formula Hybrid 2022. Whether or not you prefer this car or the standard version, whether or not you even particularly care that we have two Formula Hybrids this year, what I hope everyone comes away with from both of these cars is just an appreciation for the amount of technical diversity that is still possible in Formula One. I know that I have complained over the years about Formula One clamping down the regulations, removing possibilities for designers to exploit loopholes, and just to try things that are a little bit crazy, but hey, put it on the car, it might work. We might be heroes at the end of the day. And I've criticized Formula One for closing down a lot of those avenues for innovation. But I will eat my words here and say, well, yeah, they have done that. But people who work on these cars are very creative and very smart individuals, and they come up with designs that still manage to buck the trend. And what we've seen in 2022 thus far, with half the season gone, we have seen the top two cars in the championship following some rather different designs relative to each other. The Ferrari and the Red Bull are pretty different when you even compare them visually side by side, but they're the cars that are winning races this year. And one of those teams is going to win the Constructors' Championship this year, and the other one will be in second place. There's no contest, really, otherwise. So you've got two different designs. They are both proven race-winning designs. Just as I think in Formula Hybrid 2022, you've got two very divergent designs, even though they share a chassis. And they're both good in their own ways. You may prefer this car. You may prefer the standard version. Whichever one you prefer, they're both race legal. They're both very representative of what we can see in the real world. And they are both just utter joys to deal with. They're great additions for Assetto Corsa. They are great additions to the RaceSim Studio portfolio. And again, through all of the difficulties that presented themselves in bringing Formula Hybrid 2022 to market, RaceSim Studio, again, they have hit this absolutely out of the park. This is the best 2022 Formula One mod in existence for Assetto Corsa, and I dare say it's the best 2022 mod in existence for Assetto Corsa now and in perpetuity. Nobody else has done anything even remotely close to this. Nobody else has done a race-legal car. If you're looking for some authentic 2022 Formula One action in your Assetto Corsa setup, RaceSim Studio's Formula Hybrid 2022 is the first and only place that you dare look. I leave you with hot laps here from onboard and from trackside cameras here at Imola, so you can hear these Mercedes-inspired sounds in all of their sweet glory. And, of course, so you can see the car a little bit more clearly on a qualifying type setup, and you'll see what we've managed to do in terms of the lap time there. Stay tuned for the hot laps, everyone. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very much for watching, and, of course, we will see you soon.